attendez-les, attendez-les, oh. Attendez-les, 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 oh. Attendez-les, 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 attendez-les. Attendez-les, 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 oh. Attendez-les, 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 oh. Attendez-les, 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 attendez-les. Makange makali kolo ya Afrika Aimbaka. Attendez-les, attendez-les, adu elenga yibaka. Attendez-les mokili moko baluka. Baya ya baye baka. Attendez-les mokili moko ningana. Zambe ayibaka. Attendez-les moyino akopika. Bendele bandeko. Attendez-les, 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 attendez-les. Bakange makali kolo ya Afrika Baimbaka. Attendez-les, attendez-les, adu elenga yibaka. Attendez-les mokili moko baluka. Baya ya baye baka. Attendez-les mokili moko ningana. Zambi ayibaka. Attendez-les moyino akopika. Bendele bandeko. Attendez-les, 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 oh, 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 attendez-les.
Bonjour à tous.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this seminar organized with the Guerrand-Hermès Foundation. Before we start, I'd like to give the floor to Miriam. Thank you, Tabue.
Very important webinar organized by UNESCO and by the Guerrand-Hermès Foundation for Peace Research Institute. I really just wanted to very strongly salute Mr. Horthy, the chairperson of the Guerrand-Hermès Foundation, and also all the experts who are present here today. We at UNESCO, we really wanted to underline how important this partnership is for UNESCO and for our Slave Route Project. And we are very confident that the projects that we will carry out together will be very impactful and also last for very long. Let me also send the best wishes for a very successful event for our Assistant Director General, Mrs. Gabriela Ramos, who wanted to be here today, but she doesn't have the possibility. So she instead prepared a video message that my colleague Tabue is going to launch in a while. So on that note, I really have the pleasure to give the floor to Tabue and Nguma, who is going to be our moderator for today's event. Thank you very much. Et merci beaucoup, Tabue.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria. So I'm Tabue Nguma. I'm the coordinator of the Slave Route Project. So it's with the music, Ray Lema's music, that we call for this event. This a wonderful piece, Antanda Day, which means a day will come, is a call for hope, an invitation to live in the present with the conviction that whatever the trials are that we have to go through, better days are on the way. Ray Lema is someone we'll be back with later on, with a very interesting interview involving Marcus Miller, talk about the psychological consequences of racism, colonialism, and the power of music to heal us from these traumas. We are together here today to think about the trauma linked to the history of slavery and the way in which this still finds expression in our lives today and produces ordinary and structural racism. This event for us is an opportunity to report on the culmination of a 2-year project with our partner, the Guerrand-Hermès Foundation for Peace, so as to try to define a conceptual framework enabling us to set up an ambitious innovative program which will focus fully on how we can heal our bodies and societies from the historical trauma of slavery and racism. The panel that will take place after the opening session will go into the details of a publication called Healing the Psychological Wounds of the Slave Trade and Slavery. But we'll also look at what is at stake today in terms of research. I would now like us to listen to Mrs. Gabriela Ramos, ADG for Social Sciences at UNESCO. It's a video message that will tell us about the Slave Route Project. Alice.
Dear Mr. Horthy, dear President Bishop Michael Curry, Excellencies, distinguished guests, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this fantastic event to present pioneering work on the collective traumas and healing related to the history of slave trade and slavery, and to confirm our ambition to develop a transformative program to change the dynamics of racial injustices. In the recent years, innovative research in psychology, cognitive psychology, and epigenetics has highlighted that traumatic stress can not only modify behavior, cognition, and psychological functioning, its effects can also be transmitted to subsequent generations. So, a traumatic event we did not directly experience can still have psychological and social impacts in our life. Communities carry the history of catastrophic events and their consequences, not only as the content of their DNA, but also as part of the representation of life in general and the way they remember history. For the UNESCO Slave Route Project, the challenge is to extend this approach, acknowledge the impact of post-colonial cognitive dissonance, and develop a healing map to better understand how to heal people and communities impacted intergenerationally, and by doing so, address the structures of social and economic inequalities founded on this historic wrongdoing. According to studies published by UNESCO Slave Route Project, slavery should be understood as a process of violence and terror, aiming to transform human beings into commodities. Violence has been a core ingredient throughout the process, from the kidnapping of Africans and the deportation of captives through the Middle Passage to the everyday physical and psychological violence of the slave life. Such violence has a function. It creates a climate of chronic fear and demands submission from the slave bodies. The regime of terror produced by slavery on people of African descent for close to 3 long centuries have generated grievous traumatic stresses, which in turn has been transmitted to subsequent generations. It's really unacceptable. But the violence of slavery did not end with abolition. It has been embodied in the structures and functioning of societies themselves, excluding people of African descent from the full citizenship. The ghost of slavery continues to expose those people to micro-traumatic stress due to everyday and structural racism that reinforces transgenerational traumas. The trauma needs to be addressed at a personal level, but must also be articulated with the structural changes such as the revision of laws to prevent institutionalized dehumanization, and the development of global restorative justice to address inequalities inherited from slavery and reinforced by the structural racism. This is why UNESCO has scaled up its work against racism and discrimination. And in this regard, UNESCO is launching initiatives such as the Scoping Scanning Study to understand and assess the existing institutional, legal, and informal frameworks that enable discriminatory actions, and they are all over the place. We will also develop a universal toolbox, conceived jointly with partners around the world targeting policymakers at all levels, as well as other social actors, NGOs, women and youth associations, educational institutions in both formal and non-formal sectors, and all of them to support and combat racist ideologies and discrimination and their impacts on the ground. This work on anti-racism is articulated with our initiative on gender biases and stereotypes embedded in our cultures, laws, and institutions, which prevent the empowerment of women and girls, especially the indigenous and those of African descent, and the full realizations of their human rights. We need to change the mindset. Based on a 2-year collaboration between UNESCO, the Slave Route Project, and the GHFP Research Institute, supported by Georgetown University, we produced a desk review report that captures, maps, and analyzes conceptions and approaches to healing mass traumas. This conceptual framework will pave the way for an innovative and concrete project called Transformative Learning and Collective Healing to Overcome Traumas of Slavery. This project, through an international and multidisciplinary research center, will create a groundbreaking psychosocial healing program implemented by communities with trained young facilitators, and we're very excited about this. The program will help participants to recognize racism and structural harm that affects all communities, strengthen social relations, and build just and fair communities. An accredited online academy will be established to nurture young facilitators' leadership capabilities for initiating a strategic institutional change. I would really like to express once again my deepest gratitude to Mr. Horthy for the generous financial contribution of the Guerrand-Hermès Foundation for Peace, as well for the intellectual commitment of your team to develop and implement this project of hope. You are a fantastic partner. I would like to conclude with this beautiful quote by the African-American writer James A. Baldwin. I am what time, circumstance, history have made of me, certainly, but I am also much more than that. So we are all. The Healing Project is all about this more than that. It's about making of us much more than our history, especially its darkest moments. It is about empowering us and reestablishing our humanity. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
It's true that the dehumanizing legacy of slavery has never been adequately addressed. This is why, as you've been able to see in what Ms. Ramos said in UNESCO, we have high hopes for this new program, which could contribute to helping us heal the transgenerational trauma connected with this darker side of our shared history. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Horthy, who is president of the Guerrand-Hermès Foundation for Peace.
Assistant Director General, Ms. Gabriela Ramos, Director of Policies and Programs, Ms. Angela Mello, Presiding Bishop Michael Curry, Excellencies, distinguished guests. It is a great honor to address you on this auspicious, if challenging occasion, to present our report on approaches to healing the collective traumas and racial injustices of the Atlantic slave trade, and to launch the next phase of UNESCO Slave Route Project, implementing our augmented understanding of communal healing and applying it to the worldwide impact of racial injustice. When Xavier Guerrand-Hermès and I started the Guerrand-Hermès Foundation for Peace just over 25 years ago, it was a result of a series of conversations in the course of which we discovered that we shared a number of profound beliefs that have become the core principles of our foundation. One was that on our deepest psychological level, all human beings are one. Another was a corollary of the first, that every human being has equal value. We also agreed that if humanity is to survive the next 100 years, these truths will need to be felt and understood by the vast majority of people in the world. not just as an aspiration, but as an everyday practical reality. We had the great privilege of joining the UNESCO Slave Route team in 2017 at the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University. 2 symposia and a lot of research have resulted in the report we are presenting today. In order to create the report, we felt it was important to start with a conceptual framework about the nature of post-atrocity and post-genocide trauma, and go from there to the types of healing required based on our understanding of the different dimensions of human well-being, each of which needs to be addressed in turn. There are a few insights here that are worth mentioning briefly. We were firstly impressed with UNESCO's approach from the beginning of the project, that immersion in the detailed history of the atrocities, having a deep understanding of what happened, who did what to whom, is an essential first step, as the racism we are experiencing today is the legacy of traumas that are hundreds of years old. UNESCO clearly recognized the link between the historical events and the continuing harms, such as racism, that find expression all over the world. What that means is that any healing has to go back to understanding and coming to terms with the slavery, the way in which it has been perpetuated, and how its manifestations have changed. The harms are so deep because they are systemic. In all of the countries affected, it has become inbuilt in their institutions. Another insight was that the actual trauma or wound itself is dehumanization. In other words, the failure of one human being to recognize the humanity of the other. The core violence, therefore, is the commodification of people. So the healing processes have to be built around that idea that people have been systematically instrumentalized and brutalized, a harmful legacy that persists today. Our understanding of this is that perpetrators are also damaged through an atrocity, of course in a different way. This comes out during the healing process, when it becomes apparent that they have been living with the stress of trying to cocoon their feeling of guilt, which has cut them off from a more sympathetic society. As the report illustrates, for healing to happen, the victims and perpetrators need to first go through deep personal processes separately. But that should lead to a stage where they are able to meet and listen to each other. The experiences we have had in Lebanon, Rwanda, and other places is that when people actually listen to each other, particularly when they open up and talk about their suffering, it is almost impossible not to be touched emotionally. One suddenly sees the other person not as a member of a category, but as a real human being. What that does is shift the way people self-identify. The us versus them antagonism can give way to a really deep experience of healing for both. This prepares the group to come together and recognize the structures in their society that still dehumanize and set them apart from each other. So even if they can't change something immediately, they can come to a shared understanding of what needs to be done. This brings us to the launch of the implementation phase, which is a three-pronged approach to collective healing and systemic transformation that will be described in the short video that follows. That we are all of equal value does not mean we are identical. We all have different gifts, and that is why, to achieve anything, we need to cooperate. And to achieve something big, we need to cooperate really well. We look forward to an exciting project under the inspired guidance of Ms. Audrey Azoulay, Ms. Gabriela Ramos, and Ms. Angela Mello. As far as I can tell, you have been a wonderful audience. God bless you.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Horthy, for this message, which reminds us of the set of ethical and human values that bring together your foundation and UNESCO around this project of hope, as it was described by Madame Ramos. I'd also like to thank you, Mr. Horthy, for your generous financial contribution provided by the Foundation to launch this new initiative. Now, I should like to give the floor to a figure who plays a very important role in shaping the issue of race in the United States with the new administration, and who's also giving us hope. Now, let's listen to a message from the Mr. Michael Bruce Curry, the 27th Presiding Bishop of the Episcopal Church of the United States.
I'm Michael Curry, Presiding Bishop of the Episcopal Church. Recently, I was in a conversation with a friend, a fellow clergy person, who has been involved in the work of racial justice and reconciliation for a number of years. Someone who has worked hard personally and worked hard interpersonally, communally, socially, and politically to transform our structures, our systems, from those that are racist to those that are humane, just, compassionate, and loving. He said to me in this conversation, in some frustration, that sometimes it feels like the harder we try to escape from enslavement to the racism that is real, the more we are stuck in it. He then said something that I haven't forgotten. He said, it is as though we are stuck or caught in a spider's web. And the more we try to get out of it, the more we get entangled in it. We seem to be stuck. Whether it is policing and criminal justice, stuck. Whether it is justice in the wider society beyond criminal justice, stuck. Whether it is voting and human rights, stuck. Whether it is relationships between people, stuck. Whether it is unremitting cycles of poverty and people, stuck. The more we try to untangle, the more we seem caught in the spider's web. Our religious traditions, interfaith religious traditions, have long sensed this based on the data of human experience. That the past is with us in the present. If the past is not acknowledged, faced, confronted, and dealt with. Ignorance is darkness in this context. And the sins and the evils of the past will simply pass on to new generations as though it is a genetic inheritance of society and individuals. But we need not be victims of fate. We need not be slaves of the past. And the truth is, the past of the Atlantic slave trade and the degradation of humanity that was a part of it degraded and hurt and harmed those who were enslaved and those who did the enslaving. That all are tied in different ways in an inescapable network of a spider's web that destroys the humanity of all. but we need not be slaves to this fate. Our religious traditions have taught us that we must learn not simply to change the structures and the matters of the present, but we must learn to return, as one religious tradition says it. We must learn how to repent, as another says it. We must learn to face the dark past, to tell the truth, to face the hard truths, not to wallow in it, but to learn from the good and the bad, to turn from the dark past, to turn to new possibilities. New possibilities, having learned from the dark past, new possibilities of light. How can we live together? And for us to join hands for the healing, to do the healing work that we as individuals need, to do the healing work that we need interpersonally, to do the healing work that looks like the face of justice and dignity and humanity in the social context, to learn from that dark past, to turn from it, and for all of us to join hands together and build and construct a new future. You cannot change the past, but you can redeem it by learning from it, turning from it, and then building a new future. There is our hope. There is our future. There is the way of healing. God love you. God bless you. And God bless you in the work that we do together.
Merci.
Thank you, Bishop, for that speech, which was full of hope and which echoes Ray Lima's song, Ata Ndile, inviting us to work together to bring about better days where we will overcome the violence of racism and its traumas. That is the true ambition of this project that is being launched today to help train young people and support them to play a transformative role within their communities. Now we'll play a short video to present the ambitions of this program.
The transatlantic slave trade is at the root of contemporary racism, intergenerational trauma, and structural violence. The effects of its legacies have impacted most communities worldwide. There's a pressing need for collective healing and racial justice.
The UNESCO Slave Route Project was established in 1994 to better understand the causes and legacies of slavery across the globe and to contribute to a culture of peace. It focuses on promoting inclusion, pluralism, and dialogue, and is dedicated to the cultivation of global citizenship.
The Guerrand-Hermès Foundation for Peace is an international think tank and research institute. For 25 years, it has been exploring meaningful pathways to positive peace, such as through healing collective trauma, human-centered education, and global well-being. In 2017, as humanity progressed into International Decade for People of African Descent, the UNESCO Slave Route Project and the Guerrand-Hermès Foundation for Peace joined forces, combining global reach to overcome racism with expertise in research, healing, and education. This partnership is guided by an international advisory board of experts in the fields of slave history, communal trust building, and racial healing.
Following 2 international symposia, one held at Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. in 2018, and one at the Royal Society of the Arts, London in 2019, 2 core steps were identified.
Step 1 was research to develop a conceptual framework for understanding the notion of a collective healing. Step 2 was a desk review to draw a roadmap for effective approaches to healing the wounds of slavery.
In the first step, the team proposed an understanding of collective healing as comprised in 4 interrelated processes directed respectively at 1. The dehumanizing acts of enslavement, 2. The harmful legacies of slavery on peoples and communities, 3. The separation and antagonisms between groups, and 4. The structural violence that sustains these.
Drawing on this four-fold conceptual framework, in the second step, a desk review was carried out to bring together diverse perspectives from thinkers, scholars, and practitioners concerning ways to address the traumas and the wounds of slavery and the enduring harms of its legacies.
In mapping out major existing approaches and practices of collective healing across these 4 dimensions, the desk review proposes that only by combining political and communal processes of collective healing can humanity rebuild caring, well-being sensitive, and just systems.
In particular, the desk review report underlines a number of key healing imperatives, including publicly acknowledging the necessity for truth-telling, atonement, and reparation, recognizing and attending to transgenerational and cultural traumas, restoring a sense of wholeness and dignity in our self-awareness, transcending binary narratives, and moving towards trust, mutual belongingness, and co-action. It further suggests that these healing imperatives must be supported by systemic transformation in areas such as economics, public health, law, and education.
Formally launching this desk review report offers an opportunity to announce an ambitious and exciting new initiative that aims to empower young people to implement racial healing programs in their communities. It also advocates structural change towards racial equity. Some of these activities will be carried out by establishing a UNESCO online academy that offers a fully inclusive educational environment. Through the UNESCO Academy, young people can develop critical capacities, challenge social and epistemic injustice, and further their leadership competencies. They will also train to become skilled healing workshop facilitators and engage in dialogue, mutual learning, and collaboration. To evaluate the effectiveness of collective healing programs and to disseminate innovative knowledge, the partnership will create a UNESCO chair in educational transformation and collective healing.
Alors, comme vous avez pu le voir, c'est
As you have seen, this video aims to capture the different aspects of our project. It draws upon important concepts that we've attempted to clarify in our desk review, which you can download on the UNESCO website or on the website of the Guerrand-Hermès Foundation for Peace. The next panel will be an opportunity to open up a dialogue between our approach and historians in the field of slavery, but also decolonial and post-colonial approaches. I now hand over to our partner, Madame Jill, who will lead this expert panel, and I thank you for attending this opening ceremony. Madame Cherto, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this second session of the UNESCO's program today. Yesterday, 25th of May, marks 1 year to the day since the tragic murder of George Floyd. It was this day, well, remembering lives lived under structural violence, when we shared indignation about institutionalized racial injustice felt around the world. Today, at this most timely UNESCO event, we will revisit the root of such tragedies, including histories of the Atlantic slave trade and its legacies. More importantly, we'll explore how never again might start from here, from now, through collective healing and systemic transformation. As Tabue introduced, My name is Joy De Gru, and I'm the Senior Fellow at the Guerrand-Hermès Foundation for Peace Research Institute. I'm currently coordinating the UNESCO and the GHFP Partnership Initiative, just announced by Madam Ramos and Mr. Horthy in their presentations, and as you saw in the video. I also led the research team that developed the desk review report just launched. Now, the report draws on insights and provocations from leading historians, philosophers, and healing professionals who have reflected on and investigated on questions relevant to our inquiry about collective healing. So I'm delighted to say that, well, should be 5, but now 4 of the most distinguished scholars in these fields are present with us on this panel. So it's a great honor for me to be moderating the discussions amongst them. Now, the structure of the session, I'll just quick word on the structure of the session, is as follows. So during the first hour, we'll hear a short presentation from each of the speakers, including a brief intervention from me. And in the remaining 30 minutes, the speaker will enter into dialogue and respond to emergent questions. Well, you will soon see none of our speakers require introduction for these communities and this audience here. But just in case you would need to catch up on their latest books and projects, we'll be sharing in the chat their updated bios and links to their website. But for the audience, our panel welcome an active engagement from you. So please use Zoom's Q&A function to send your questions and comments. Well, we will do our best to fold these and review this and probably summarize them before posed to the panel. Now, let's turn to our first speaker, Professor Lovejoy. Professor Paul Lovejoy is a Canadian Research Chair in African Diaspora History, and he's also a distinguished research professor at Duke University and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Now, Professor Lovejoy, in our desk review report, we challenged a typical view as follows. That throughout history, some people would say, throughout history of humanity, slavery was a phenomenon found in many places. But our research illustrates that historically, Atlantic slave trade demarcated from all other forms of slavery due to its brutality, horror, and inhumaneness, especially in terms of its, like Mr. Horthy talking about, instrumentalizing and commodifying and enslaving persons for economic gain. Now, scholars such as Professor Achille Mbambi, who unfortunately could not be with us because of a power cut in his hometown, but Professor Mbambi claimed that European modernity and prosperity was built upon racist capitalism. But you yourself, Professor Lovejoy, also confronted the problem for continued use of the term of slave to describe someone who had been enslaved or who have suffered from slavery, and how it can sustain the effects of dehumanizing acts, further impinging on their dignity. So Professor Lovejoy, the floor is yours. Professor Lovejoy. We seem not to be able to connect with Professor Lovejoy.
No, I'm here.
Okay, please. Thank you. Perfect. Go ahead.
I'm very pleased to be with you on this important occasion, healing the wounds of slave trade and slavery. As we enter a new phase of an initiative that was launched in Ouida, Republic du Benin, in 1994, an event which I had the good fortune to attend. Today, I intend to address 2 interrelated issues. First, I will directly confront the problem of using the term slave to describe someone who has been enslaved or who has suffered from slavery. Second, I want to emphasize the humanity of those who suffered from slavery. So first, the term slave. We have to recognize our collective denial that people who have been referred to as slaves had their own identities and their own humanity. I will not directly address the debate that has emerged in the Francophone discourse, which has not been, but that same debate has characterized discussions in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. But at least in these languages, it appears a consensus has emerged. The term slave has to be renounced. And we hope that soon the Francophone debate will reach a similar conclusion. Second, I want to discuss the focus of current research on the reconstruction of biographical profiles of individuals who were enslaved for part of their lives, but where testimony of these people has enabled the documentation of life histories beyond the slavery context. The aim of this research is to resurrect the dignity of individuals as people, rather than exaggerate the fact that under slavery, they were treated as property. Finally, my intention will be to demonstrate that the ever-changing racist discourse that plagues human relationships to this day is a crime against our collective dignity as human beings. People today are not descended from slaves. They are descended from their ancestors, and whatever happened to their ancestors is not a reflection on what all people are entitled to in terms of their lives today, which is equitable treatment, education, healthcare, and the pursuit of sustainable livelihoods. I want to draw attention to several websites and scholarly research projects that are documenting history so that we can overcome a fixation on people as slaves or somehow tainted by persecution that was inflicted through criminal subjugation in the past. One of these projects, which I direct, is called Freedom Narratives. And it's a website that is being developed online, very easy to find. It's Freedom Narratives, one word, freedomnarratives.org. This project focuses on individuals who were born in West Africa, but suffered slavery for a part of their lives. Why do we call them freedom narratives? Because in almost all cases, the individuals whose life stories we are reestablishing were born free. And a very large number of these people actually died free, having regained their freedom in one way or another. We see that slavery did not determine their lives. The violence and subjugation affected their lives, of course, but it did not deny these people their dignity and their will to resist. At present, the project has numbers of about several thousand individuals that we've been able to reconstruct their life histories. We know from the documentation that we have at hand that eventually we will be able to retell the stories of several 100,000 people. Now, this is really only a small portion of the total number of people who suffered from slavery. But nonetheless, it's a significant number of people, and it allows us as scholars and as students, and indeed all people, to understand what happened in the past much better than we have been able to do. It allows us to see people as people, not to see people as property. I also want to urge you to visit another website that outlines 24 projects, all on the web, which deal with aspects of the history of people who suffered from slavery. That website is known as walkwithweb, one word, .org. And on walkwithweb.org, you will see introductions to all of these 24 projects, and it will demonstrate to you that the amount of research and the possibilities of reconstructing the past of people who have suffered from slavery, the possibilities seem to be endless at this point. We have to come to terms with the past to achieve reparations and an equitable world society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. That's quite exciting to know that several of these websites are available, and Freedom Narratives clearly puts a human face to otherwise just a set of statistics. But given your research and your experience, what is the most significant learning or insight that emerged from this over 700 people's narratives, especially in terms of human resilience and agency in a time of such a great brutality and suffering?
Well, you've just said it. The most important thing that we've discovered, I believe, is the fact that people were not property, that people had their own lives, they had their own dignity, they had their own abilities to survive and to create relationships and to somehow suffer through the brutality in a ways that reinforced each other's determination to live.
Thank you. With that hopeful thought, we're going to turn to our next speaker, Dr. Joy De Gru. Dr. Joy De Gru is an African-American researcher, writer, educator, but I also add that she's a great healing professional. Dr. Joy, you have developed the theory of post-traumatic slave syndrome and have invested extensively race matters and the continued traumatic experience in the context of African-American life in the United States. Dr. Joy, take it away.
Yes, I am very pleased to be here. I think that this is extraordinary, and the timing of it is quite critical. My work, specifically, looking at the role of history in healing, understanding the role of history in all healing, in fact. And so when I started to embark upon this idea, it didn't come from like nowhere. It came from lived experience. It came from looking at my people, looking at the world, looking at how we move through the world. So I think originally, when I was a small child, I remember hearing things that didn't make sense for me. Made sense for me later as a social scientist and as a clinician, but I didn't understand some of the things I heard people say that look like me. People that look like me that would say, "Oh my goodness, she was such a pretty girl, even though she was dark. Oh gosh, he was very attractive. He had good hair." These were statements that I heard, I grew up with, but seemed to be not just my experience, but was showing up in other areas and everywhere I went where I saw people that looked like me. And in fact, as I did the deep dive, I began to look at folks that had experienced historically the trauma of enslavement. And as I looked at that, I started to look at adaptive behaviors. In other words, when you are living in a hostile environment, you develop the kinds of behaviors to survive that hostility. And so it's not hard to understand when we look at trauma itself and individual trauma that can render a person emotionally, physically, non-functional. So we have to then do the math on hundreds of years of trauma that was never addressed, that was never healed. But as was said before, this whole idea of enduring that with your sense of nobility intact, with your sense of humanity intact, is an extraordinary an ability, which is what we've seen. But there are also some leftover residual pieces. A friend of mine, a colleague, calls it the poison in the cookies. We have this rich, wonderful cultural reality, and then we have this traumatic legacy. And some of what we've done to survive those legacies of trauma, we need to discard now. Made sense then, don't make sense now. But we can't tease the poison from the cookies on an individual, family, community, or society's level, on a societal level. We cannot clear the poison from the cookies, those adaptive behaviors, those self-analysis that is so scathing and negative. We can't do that if we aren't willing to look at the nature of the injury. And that's why this project becomes so important. You cannot fix what you don't understand or you're unwilling to look at. And if you look at any branch of medicine, you go to the doctor. Doesn't matter what, an infected fingernail, okay, it doesn't matter what you go for. They're going to ask you your history. Not just your history. We want to know your mother's history, your father, however much, because we understand the relationship of history and healing, those connections that we have with one another and with even within our own family structure. We recognize that. So when we think about healing, I'm reminded that it's the secrets that make us sick. As a clinician, you know, working with people that would come to me with a presenting problem, and inevitably it would be that secret. And you see the dark secret, America's pathology, for example, is our denial. America's pathology is the secret. And I think that Randall Robinson, incredible historian, scholar, activist, leader, he said the worst thing you can do to a people is to rob them of the memory of themselves. And the memory of ourselves that we have intact, that have created these extraordinary people today, that history, that memory has been distorted. In other words, the truth didn't make it to the textbook, which is the reason why we have to do this different trajectory in terms of where we're going. And if we are not telling the truth, and I believe truthfulness is the foundation of all human virtue. So we have to tell the truth. So my work has been about, one, let's start identifying, let's start remembering with clarity and with nobility and with strength and with resilience. Let's start remembering so that we can forge a new trajectory for our children, a healing for them so that they do not embody or incorporate or internalize these negative attributions that have been placed upon us, that dehumanization piece that continues. So that's part one. First is to know, and I think when people know better, they can do better. So first we need to understand the nature of this injury. The other thing we have to appreciate about this is you got to stop hitting me. Okay, if you've broken my leg, and then you complain that I limp, and you continue to assault me. It's difficult to heal under those circumstances, which is a reason why this has to be part and parcel with racial justice, with structural institutional justice and equity. These words that are floating around, but we got to put some teeth in them. We have to have accountability, and we have to make certain those things are in place. And for those who are new to this, those who are not quite clear, there is just this kind of mythology around slavery, and particularly American chattel slavery, that somehow it ended. And well, the playing field got leveled. And what followed was more trauma and racial terrorism, all the way to this horrific anniversary of George Floyd. So again, that's what the work is. The work is knowing, doing, changing that trajectory, changing that narrative that becomes one that is mine and my children and my grandchildren's, and to then move towards a global society that recognizes our intrinsic oneness as human beings. That's my work.
It's beautiful. Thank you very much, Joy, for this really strong illustration of the current potential of the current path to healing. The question that came to my mind is following. So how might we go beyond antagonism. You talk about this importance of a oneness. And we know that it's important to remember the past, honor the memories for suffering as you illustrated. At the same time, the deep wounds and scars can at times evoke anger and violence for some, and the feeling for guilt or irresponsibility for others. So how do we engage in this deep tissue of, I will borrow because Ashila Mbembe is not here, I will just keep borrowing his words, the deep tissue of love, including self-love, and the valuing each other's humanity. Again, Professor Mbembe's word, the co-belonging, the co-belongingness. So in other words, I'm really interested in what can we do to bridge this deep divide in the approach that you proposed?
Well, you know, it's interesting that you asked that. You know, I'm teaching a 10-week graduate level course on my work on post-traumatic slave syndrome, America's legacy of enduring injury and healing. And these are people from all over that are part of this class. But what we're learning in terms of the data, in terms of the research, is part of the healing, you know, has to do with literally how you mind. How are you thinking about things, right? To do that deep examination, we know that minding and the paying attention and being present can actually heal the telomeres, can heal the protectors of the DNA strands. We can change our own DNA with the way we think. But when it comes to human beings and our engagement, what we've also learned, how important proximity is. The polarization is largely part of the fear and the ignorance. And the more you keep people apart, the more you can continue the lie of someone being superior and someone being inferior or dangerous or all of those things. But you see, once we come into community, when we engage with one another, even in the research, the words that have been used where they have bias, you know, trying to reduce bias, they'll say, well, you know, we took the police officers and they looked at a scenario where someone of another race saves them. And that is someone that of their own race that attacks them. And then in the end, it says the person is made to feel. And I always thought that was interesting, made to feel as if this person of color, this Black man, this Black woman actually saved them, made to feel. And part of it, the answer is in that feeling. This is heart work. This is about really in recognizing my humanity and recognizing your own. And when they said made to feel, they were able to reduce bias in one setting, 48%. Being made to feel. You see, so rather than being made to feel, engage me in a relationship.
Thank you.
And we can begin to destroy those barriers instantly.
That's beautiful. It's beautiful. I like the word heart work. This is heart work. And again, I will borrow Ashila Mbembe's word, being relational, this and bringing Paul's work and narratival, agentic work, and combine your work. It's about being human. Is to assert what one is. But I'm almost imagining that this work will be leading to us becoming us. Is leading the humanity becoming us. And again, Mbembe's work will bring us, but bring nature as part of the us. Thank you, Joy. Now we move on to our next speaker, Professor Miriam Kotia, and who's award-winning and distinguished historian at the French National Center for Scientific Research. Miriam would give her presentation in French, but let's just set the context. Miriam, the death review report just launched has highlighted the fact several imperatives of healing, including publicly recognizing slavery as a crime against humanity and the need for atonement and reparation. However, yesterday, on the day when the world shared a moment of racial reckoning, Christiane Taubira, who introduced the French anti-slavery law, claims that no reparation can compensate for the millions of lost lives. In fact, her words I just read from the Harvard Review is, so let's make it clear, the crime itself is not repairable. Sorry is not enough. So how might reparation help with the collective healing? Professor Kotia, the floor is yours.
Merci, merci.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to speak in French today. First of all, I'd like to thank UNESCO and the Slave Route Project. I hope that it will become the Enslaved Route Project, as I share the term used by Paul Lovejoy. I'd like to thank the Slave Route Project of UNESCO and the GHFP for allowing this meeting to take place. Today, I'd like to talk about a case in point, which is France. As you mentioned, in 2021, we celebrated the 20-year anniversary of the Taubira law, which declared slavery as a crime against humanity. This law is regularly cited today to justify the revendications of citizen groups. And it's a law that actually went almost unnoticed when it was passed. It's an unusual law because among individuals who are concerned by this history, it provokes an emotion. And it's also unique in the French justice system because of its object, the slave trade and slavery, but also the fact that it retroactively acts upon events that took place a century and a half earlier. The memory of history is not a cold subject of study. It's a very intimate, painful topic, and it can bring about great unease. As the first president of the Committee for on Slavery and Enslavement mentioned. So what does this law state? Well, since the Third Republic, being French on the basis of race means being white and living on continental mainland France. That's what the law denounced. And at the same time, this law stated that people who were from the French West Indies, who lived in France, must have their history enshrined in French history, and that what their ancestors had suffered should be enshrined as a crime against humanity, which was one of the most abhorrent crimes. In the first article, the law states that the articulation of slavery and colonialization in France and the acceptation of a plural non-white identity within France. This reflects a confrontation between the memory of some French people and the history of France. Now, I'd like to introduce two effects of this law which have been very important. First of all, the commemoration around the abolition of slavery, and secondly, the issue of reparations, which I will discuss at the end of my presentation. In 2005, 4 years after the Taubira law was passed, the date of commemoration was decided as the 10th of May, in a period of great tension. The commemoration of this event as a form of recognition was a demand from the President of the Republic. Marie Scondé wrote that the great majority of our citizens who are the descendants of enslaved people continue to be marginalized and ignored. These fellow citizens see this as a denial of their own existence and of their integration into the Republic. In 2006, the 10th of May was finally decided as the commemoration day to commemorate the slave trade, slavery, and its abolition. And what was said at the time, in a way, it was a form of reparation, was that beyond abolition, the whole memory of slavery must be shared and acknowledged today. So where are we now? Well, another date has been added in 2013, a second commemoration date, which was installed on the 23rd of May, which is understood as being a tribute to the victims of colonial slavery, defined as descendants of slaves, genealogically speaking. However, this is very important. The commemoration on the 10th of May opened up a whole field of possibilities for citizens' initiatives. The power of the Tabue law was that it gave legitimacy to local claims, associations, and even individuals who were calling for reparations through exhibitions, projections, concerts, shows. All of these events remind us of the memory of slavery. And I'd like to insist on this because I think it ties into the discussion on reparations. The commemoration on the abolition of slavery has become a time at which citizens recognize and acknowledge other social actors. And it's important for the Republic. The month for the fight against slavery, which brings together all of the events around the abolition of slavery, was launched in 2014, and every year 100 events take place across France. And it accounts for the diversity of experiences of slavery and shows how the memory of slavery contributes to the affirmation of a dignified citizen and not a victim. Beyond this idea of reparations, which was supported by Christian Taubira, initially, it was planned that a group of experts would call for what we called indemnization or compensation. However, this text was rejected for two reasons at first. First of all, because this would open up uncontrolled use of a legal notion, but secondly, because it brings about the issue of monetarization of the memory of slaves and slavery. It was warned against making money off the suffering of others. And therefore, it was the notion of symbolic and moral reparations that was retained, which garners great consensus in France. First of all, recognizing the history of slavery. In France, the reparations include several fields of action: teaching, research, the recognition of memory institutions, places for acknowledging the heritage of this history, but also international development. These fields of action have been developed over the past years despite ideological obstacles. And I'll discuss this later. Since 2015, there has been a pedagogical initiative by the Ministry of Education, which is an interdisciplinary national competition about history and the memory of slavery. And over 15,000 people take part in this. However, reparations are still, in some cases, considered to be indemnization by some. And in some cases, this goes through corrective justice. We are seeking for a fair society and the recognition of what was endured by the descendants of enslaved people. So what are these claims about? Well, they make the discussions about the abolition of slavery relevant in France. When slave owners received compensation, or rather monetary, received money for the value of the bodies of their slaves, in 1825, France asked Saint-Domingue in Haiti to pay 80 million gold francs in reparations, and in 1938, France declared a permanent abolition of slavery with 126 million gold francs to be paid to the slave owners in the French colonies. Therefore, reparations in the form of economic and monetary exchanges are still supported by some international organizations, such as the International Movement for Reparations, within the Atlantic context. And lastly, on both sides of the Atlantic, to quote Ta-Nehisi Coates, reparations must spell the revolution of minds. This is very important. In mainland France, an important link was made between the Black Lives Matter movement, which began in the USA, and the Justice for Adama Traoré movement in France, which emerged from the death of a young black man at the hands of the police. Therefore, the Taubira law, first of all, gave a framework for demands for justice around the issue of race. And it has also allowed for the reformulation of racialized judgments on enslaved persons' descendants and black people. It has called into question the legitimacy of statues in public spaces such as Colbert, Joséphine de Beauharnais, and Martinique. These movements show an unended process of political willingness in terms of slavery in contemporary society in France. This movement is essential to heal the wounds of slavery, whether it's overseas or in mainland France. What's being asked for is a combination of public policies, including education, a change in social representations which ensure a representation of the memory of slavery, and also that bring about inter-recognition between citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad that you have brought in the notion of education, which is an aspect of this UNESCO Slave Route project and the GHFP's initiative, the new initiative. And you probably also know that Christiana Taubira herself also proposes that education be a key to this collective healing and what you may call reconciliatory justice. So I just wondered if you just briefly comment more specifically, what might we do in education beyond sort of study of history, beyond the commemoration of that past and so on? What are the practical approach education system could take to bring us towards that a sense of healing?
Alors, la question de l'éducation.
Well, the issue of education is addressed at a national level, I'd say at the same time, unfortunately and fortunately, because in France, school curricula depend on the Ministry of Education. And therefore, it was important, and this was a result of the Taubira law in Article 2, which stated that education on slavery and the slave trade would become compulsory. And I think that there's a very important discussion that needs to take place. The Taubira law showed to what extent legal frameworks were important, because these are frameworks of reference which allow us to call for public policies because the law exists. So when national choices are made in the field of education, this is extremely important in my view, even though it's not sufficient. In France, teaching on the history of slavery and the slave trade is not necessarily carried out in as comprehensive a manner as it should be. And regularly, as someone who's defending the teaching of these issues, we constantly have to remind the ministry how important these issues are. So the battle has not been won. We need to continue to fight for this. And I'd like to insist on the national teaching competition that we set up in France, which is an extremely important competition because it's multidisciplinary. It brings together history, geography, arts, philosophy, music, around the history and the memory of slavery. So it allows us to bring students together and to ask them to reflect on this history in a concrete manner. And this allows them to develop mutual recognition, which I think is very important.
That's indeed very important. And how do we establish mutual recognition as human beings, and how do we live together in harmony? That is the important element for education. Now, there is a question on the Q&A section and saying that considering the colonization and slavery fed from each other through supply and demand of enslaved people and as commodities and so on. So what would we consider to be the best practice for implementing compensation and reparation programs globally and so on? So we will forward this question with the next speaker's presentation. Thank you, Miriam. So we now turn to Professor Walter Mignolo, an Argentine semiotician and distinguished professor of Romance study at Duke University. Walter, our desk review recognizes the 4 dimensions of healing. So far, we have heard that healing must first address the dehumanizing act per se, and such as Paul initiated. And then secondly, it must deal with people's suffering and continued experience of alienation, as Joy discussed, and relational antagonism. And we just heard from Miriam looking at the systemic transformation as the foundation to a sense of weenies and so on. So we love to hear your perspectives on the legacies of colonialwood as that question brought into the view, and what potentiality might a decolonial approach offer to collective healing.
Well, thank you very much. I will cut short my thanks because we don't have much time. So I don't know what happened to the screen, but
you're here. You're perfect. You're here. You're perfect. Let's just go on.
Okay. Okay, because so thank you again for this opportunity, and I was really pleased to listen what the previous speaker, because I felt that a lot of things that have to be said in an occasion like this, with not much time, have been said. So I will make 2 points to contribute to the conversation. One is decolonial healing, and the other is the systemic aspect of racism that was already mentioned. So I came to the question of healing and decolonial healing, more specifically to my research, of course, since the late 80s and 90s, because I was studying colonialism, but more specifically since 2011, when I joined a collective led by Caribbean men and women in Europe. That collective is called BBOP, Black Europe Body Politics. And there was a collective. We met every year, and it was all kind of people, white and black and yellow, but also activists and faculties and artists and journalists, etc. And the purpose of Black Europe body politics was precisely decolonial healing. Why decolonial healing? Because at that time, the people I was working and having conversation with, we already accepted as a premise that coloniality is not over, is all over. And coloniality is a machine, has been a machine built since the 16th century to produce injustice and dehumanization. And the only way to I don't know the only way, but one way to confront that was rebuild the communal, the society based on the concept of the individual destroyed. So BBOP has that kind of function, decolonial healing through rebuilding the communal. So what I learned from that, and I think it's important to mention at this point, because I met a lot of other people who were kind of concerned with this, is that the colonial healing has been taken up by indigenous people, because I also work with many, and in conversation with indigenous people in the Americas. The colonial healing, not mentioned like that, has been taken up by themselves for a long time. Now the concept comes into the conversation, and for example, Lorena Cabnal, who is a Maya Xinca feminist activist and intellectual, talk about cosmic political healing, because the question is there not just to heal and relate to us, but we have to learn to relate with the big family that is trees and air and sun that indigenous people knew for a long time and has been destituted. So in the case of transatlantic slavery, because it was a slavery before, but transatlantic slavery is a very special kind of slavery, because it's related to racism, in the sense that there were, in previous civilization, culture, you want to call it, there were differences and distinction, and one people were superior to the other. But none of this society connect racism with capitalism. And I think that that is the big difference, because when you connect racism with capitalism, and especially in the captive, in the case of the captive human being African that were free and they were converted into a slave. I lost my train of thought. You convert them, not only exploitation of labor in the plantation, but as it was said, you convert human being into a commodity. And that was very clear, stated in 1944 by Eric Williams, a Trinidadian political scientist, and then Prime Minister of Trinidad, 61-81, where he said, well, the great transformation of the Great Revolution in England is to kind of reestablish free trade. But among the commodities traded in the free trade were African captive. So what I learned, again, I will say, is from the energy and the need of people I know, I mean, in the Caribbean, that they have been taking that up for a long time. So, for example, Jean Casimir just published a book, Haiti, a Decolonial History. He is a Haitian, and he recognized himself as, he recognized the captives, not the slaves. It was not the slave, they were captive. It's the captive who did engage and achieve the colonial revolution that he connects with. Because I don't see my ancestor as a slave, as a victim. I see my ancestor as victorious community that achieved the reconstruction of the communal in the New World, in Haiti, which is well and alive with conflicts and difficulties, of course, today. And for example, I can mention Leslie Ann Brown. I just got a message from her this morning, who wrote a fantastic book, The Colonial Daughter, letter from a Black woman to her son, to her European son. So Gloria Wecker, that wrote a fantastic book, White Innocence, and the question what she studied there is not her, she's from Suriname, what she studied there is the white innocence of the Dutch. So that kind of reversal, that kind of taking over our own responsibility and changing the term of the conversation, redirecting the object of studies, transforming whiteness into the matter of investigation, is something that is very important today. It was said many times in the kind of reconstitution of what has been destituted and who were the people who destituted. So my second point is, I don't want to talk to, I think I have 3 minutes or 2 minutes. The second point is, yes, we are all involved in systemic racism. There is no one outside of it. The question is, where are we located in the system? So to recognize that, to start from ourselves, not from kind of saying, well, slavery is over there. Where do we feel coloniality? Where do we sense coloniality? Where has been placed in the colonial matrix of power, as we call it? So in that colonial matrix of power, somebody creates racism. Racism is not something that was just came with a big bang. When was created? Who created? Why created? That is one of the questions. The second question is, there are perpetrators and managers. Who are the perpetrators? Who are the managers? And then who are the targets? And so where are we there? Are we among the perpetrators and the manager? We are the target. We are the descendant of the creator. Well, that is the beginning. We have to know where we have been placed. And to close that, I will invite all of the listener and reader to think about this. Imagine a triangle. If I have the blackboard, I will. If I was in my classroom with my student, I will do the. I will do the triangle. A triangle where you put races on the top, because race is already a racist concept. And then you put on the left the left-hand bottom end of the triangle, you put capitalism and patriarchy. And on the right, you put slavery. So the question is, what are the relationship between those three terms? I think that from my view, to deal with the problem what we are facing, number one is where do we feel coloniality, and number two is where are we located in this system. So my last point is that we think about the relationship between racist capitalism and slavery, and transatlantic slavery, because it's related with capitalism. There is no capitalism before the 16th century. We realize that we all, at least in the Atlantic, but beyond, I cannot talk beyond that, but in the Atlantic, we, in the United States, in Europe, and in Africa, we are living in a patriarchal and capitalist society. So the conversation has in my, and we know, I mean, patriarchy and capitalism is a civilization of death. So the question is conversation to take ourselves, rebuilding the communal. We cannot expect that the state or the corporation or the IMF will kind of join us in this enterprise. But we are actors, we have action. So we have to kind of engage in this kind of conversation to build, rebuild a matristic culture, but not matristic in the sense of matriarchal, in relation to Mother Earth.
Thank you. I know time is short, but there's so many questions came to my mind, but equally I'm sure that it came to the participants out there. I'm so interested in what you just highlighted, the economy. Economy is a system of production, but also reproduction of power, and including the production of race and blackness and trauma and so on. So one question I have in mind is how might decolonization help undermine racism when racism is actually structural and institutional? So that's one question. The other question I have in mind is adding to the list of questions you already had is in terms of decolonial healing. So what is the place again of education in a place of education that can embrace this decolonial practice that you just highlighted, and also bringing in the non-Eurocentric idea, be it is to epistemic access, or it is to do with other ways of learning. So, so that we can building and rebuilding on the communal, the easy word. So which one would you like to pick? And so that you have a very brief comment, Walter.
Okay, I will be very short. So the task, the decolonial task, as we, the people who are into this project, do it, is just to understand when coloniality was formed, how was formed, who did it, what institution, what actor, what language. That is our kind of analytic project, is the decolonial, because you cannot understand decolonial in our view if you understand coloniality. You cannot understand psychoanalysis if you don't understand the unconscious, and vice versa. So the second, education, is education has to be differentiated from schooling. I think what we have been schooled, and the institution school us, and in a kind of capitalist neoliberal kind of civilization, the schooling is going to technology. So the question is that we, the people, to put it in that way, we, the people, are responsible for education, and education is conversation. And the question is to change the term of the conversation, because the term of the conversation change your emotioning and your sensing and your feeling. And that is where love and respect for all the living, for the person, for the other person, is fundamental. So for me, education is beyond, it can be in the institution, but it's beyond the institution. Bebop was education.
Thank you so much. And let's bring all our speakers back. Thank you for the very swift and concise presentation from all of you. I'm very grateful for the how considerate you are about the time. So there are some questions emergent, both from the audience, but also from the team. And as you know, the UNESCO project is guided by an advisory board. And when the advisory board heard that we're going to have this session, so they came up with a few questions. So before we go into the question, would you like to offer some comment, immediate comment to each other's presentation? I'm sure there's a lot. Your mind is very active, and you all have this rhetorical talent to share. Please, let's just have a very quick round of direct comments on each other's presentation. Joy, please, you start.
I think I am just so pleased to just look at the breadth of experience and expertise, but also looking at the fact that, you know, so often being a person of African descent, we've waited for, I think, this very thing to happen, where folks really lean into this from various disciplines that are recognizing it, and that we're not always the ones that have to carry the torch. So I just wanted to just commend everyone and to thank you for staying true to it and recognizing our collective humanity in your work.
Thank you, Joy, for this first comment. Anyone else? Paul, please.
I would like to say that we're scholars and we're trained in disciplines. And what I have come to appreciate more and more over the years is how much we can learn from each other, because our separate disciplines actually try to channel us for very, very good reasons into certain types of approaches, certain types of questions, certain types of procedures. But it's hard initially for a historian who deals with the 18th and 19th century to see how what I do and have done and what my colleagues have done is relevant to everybody. And the psychological dimensions, all of these things that as historians we suppress. We don't talk about people's psychologies. We talk about we try to reconstruct what happens, and to see the interconnected connections. This is really crucial because, you know, we keep reinventing the wheel. You know, we know racism is nasty. We know it continues. We know it perpetuates itself. We know it finds new ways to raise its ugly head. And we try to teach our students to deal with it. And, you know, we keep failing. It doesn't go away. And it's only when we really start to interact that I think that we begin to see how holistic we have to take an approach to the systemic racism and misinterpretation and misuse of the past to subjugate people in the present.
Yeah. I sometimes wonder if Professor Achille Mbambi here, what he would say, because Paul, one of Achille's idea is that today, as the world, it's the era of entanglement, and he says, and so discipline as it traditionally established, as it was established, that traditionally established, are no longer sort of necessarily being sort of in a very neat space, because now it's all crossed interdisciplinary or in multi-interdisciplinary and so on. And that's very much a decolonial approach to knowledge. I'll pick from Miriam. Go ahead.
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you. I'll continue to speak in French, if that's okay. Indeed. Well, I think we tend to be shut off within our own disciplines as historians, as was mentioned by Paul. But what post-colonial studies have taught us is that we need to go and look for answers in other disciplines. And above all, to pay attention to the powers at play in our various disciplines and in the writing of history. And to ask about the powers at play in the writing of history means to reflect on the meaning of words and the importance of words, the importance of building categories, as Walter mentioned. It means reflecting on the appearance or the emergence of racial categories and acknowledging that this is happening in a pre-capitalist and pro-slavery world. And these racial categories that we use without calling into question their origins or thinking about these origins have been built in a world of domination and violence. And in my view, these elements are very important because words produce representations. So we need to change words if we want to fight racism. Because there's a failure of the anti-racist narrative. I think we can acknowledge that, because just saying that racism is bad, well, it doesn't really achieve much. So we need to go beyond the anti-racist narrative and look at the roots of the issue. And for me, the roots can be found in words, categories, and representations that we need to challenge. And I think this is very important. So disconnecting moral judgment, which prevents us from addressing social issues.
Thank you so much. Walter, would you like to comment, or shall we move on to questions?
No, I would like to make some comments on the discipline. With the colonial, we praise ourselves for being undisciplinary, not interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary. But what does it mean to use the discipline and instead of letting the discipline use you? We have been trained in some, and let's use it. But we are person too. So the question is to engage in conversation as person and use our discipline. So the second question is modernity, and that's how coloniality works, make us believe that racism is a question, is a biological question. That's a fiction. Racism is an epistemic invention. It's an invention of knowledge. So use the discipline to dismantle the knowledge that invented racism as a biological thing. And third, we have to be attentive to the vocabulary, because we are governed by the vocabulary of the discipline and the vocabulary of modernity, the Western modernity, and the media. So, for example, I love the observation of Paul. I won't get rid of a slave or a slavery. I would say that is a modern concept. We talk about captives, and we not talk about trauma. Trauma is a problem of individual in Western society. We talk about the colonial wound, but let trauma be their responsibility. And we just change direction and talk about captives and how coloniality produced colonial wound, and that is what we have to kind of reconstruct what has been destituted, the humanity, the humanness. The humanness of many people have been target of racism.
Yeah. Thank you. So I have three questions in place, and we only have about 10 minutes to wrap up. So probably if you want to pick a question, or just let me know. So these three, first question is, could you provide some examples in your own work that can support and explain the need for a holistic approach to healing, to collective healing? So that's one, examples. The second one is this. It says the psychosocial experience of the legacies of transatlantic slave trades are obviously quite different from descendants of those formerly enslaved or captive, compared to the descendant of those who have enslaved, or who have enslaved others, or have been beneficiary of this brutality. So would you share your analysis of the different dynamics and the implications for healing practice? And you see, we're all focusing on healing. The third question is, the idea of a collective trauma seems very complex. So what practical steps can individuals and groups take to realistically to be actionable and to bring some kind of to contribute to collective healing? So three questions. Anyone would like to go for first? Yeah,
well, I
Walter,
mean, I just stopped talking, so I want to wait for my friends to to go ahead.
I'm waiting for Joy.
I need you to repeat the first question.
Okay, the first question is, as we said, you probably heard from the launch that we think healing should be directed at 4 dimensions. Yeah, so in terms of the humanizing act, in terms of the effects and the relationship, the relational, but also the structural. So that constitutes the holistic. So can you think of an example in your own work that supports this holistic approach?
I think that a lot of the work that I'm doing right now, we've created evidence-based models, for example, to use in schools, and to start looking at teachers, and to start looking at unconscious bias, for example. We recognize, and more recently, if you've followed any of the news in the States, there's been a number, from Harvard to preschool folks that are just literally horrifically racist, extraordinarily harmful to children. Right. And again, whether you know that or not, we also have research that suggests, like, again, the bias is so great that when given an opportunity, Yale Child Study Center did a study of 136 pre-K teachers, asked them to look at a short video and to identify any potential problems or that may occur. Where do you see a potential problem? And rather than wait for them to identify this verbally, they looked at the trajectory of their gaze to see where they looked when they were expecting a problem. And of course, they looked more at children of color than white children, and specifically more at Black boys. So what we begin to realize is that parents, and very often those of us that have had to send our children into these institutions and hope that they're not going to harm them, hope that they're not going to discourage them or hurt them in any way, because that has been our experience. But I would submit to you that you don't hope. I don't send my grandkids in and hope for the best. I go in and say, I need to know, Ms. Jones, Mr. Smith, whoever you are, how you're going to mitigate any potential harm that might potentially come as a result of your conscious or unconscious bias to these children, all of them. And they may say to me, well, I don't understand what you're saying. I'm going to give you the data. Here it is. Okay, I want you to read it because I need to hold you accountable. Do you see? It's not, I can build up the child, and that's very important for us to instill that sense of their own humanity. But I also have to hold folks accountable who want to say, I just didn't know. Well, this song isn't about you, and whether you know or not, I'm going to need you to tell me very specifically and strategically how you're going to mitigate any potential harm because of your own blind spot. Yeah. And the good news is, because I've done work in these institutions, I've trained the teachers, I've given them the data. Now I can hold you accountable. But what we're not going to do systemically is send our children in there and hope. Okay, so I think you have to have that balance of, I'm going to give you this information. I'm not going to hold you accountable for something you don't know, but I am going to let you know that these things, and we know, set the stage for how children learn from that moment forward. And what do our children always say? Latinx children, African-American children, Indigenous children, when they're put in these states, why aren't you doing well in this class? Why did you get a D? Because my teacher doesn't like me. That's what they say. So we need to listen to the children. And we need to understand this systemically. Build the child, hold its institutions accountable.
That's really interesting. It's a systemic question, yet we start with the individual, but also empowering ourselves to know how to engage. So it's about co-creating the system rather than Miriam talk about, it's the states, designing the system is the state's task, but you're saying that everybody should have a part to play in co-creating the system. Thank you. Miriam, I would like you to choose another different question, please.
No. I just want to say something. I don't say it's a state task. I say it's a useful to have a state framework, which is quite different, because you could refer to the law. But of course, when you are in school and when you are teaching, is not at all a question of state. It's a question of relationship between the teacher and the pupils, and that's very important. And I have to say that in France, there was an inquiry in school about teaching slavery. And what two researchers, Benoît Falaise, one of them, and the other is Sébastien Ledoux, they just stress the fact that when the teacher teach about slavery and slave trade, they turn to the Black kids and they ask to the Black kids, what do you think of this story? Could you imagine that? It means that the history of slavery and slave trade is only for Black kids. It's not for all people, all students in the classroom. And that's the problem. That's really the problem. This is not a shared history. So I just want to stress this fact. I'm not owning that states make everything. Not at all, not at all. But it's a good framework.
Exactly. The systemic approach requires law, requires a framework, but also requires a legal framework, but more importantly, it requires ethical framework to set that foundation on which we can build pillars of humanist that Walter just said. Mm-hmm. So now, Walter and Paul, you each have like 1 minute to give a comment. I'm sorry, I was told that we need to close soon. I'm really sorry.
I just want to share with you a moment, an insight I had many years ago when John Kofi Finn, the very distinguished Ghanaian historian, who's no longer with us today, but he said to me, I look at my ancestors, some of them were enslaved, some of them were enslavers.
Yeah,
mm-hmm. Exactly. Got to come to terms with this. And I just shook my head and said, yes, we've got to come to terms with the past so that we can live in an equitable present.
Thank you.
So Toussaint Louverture was a liberated slave that became a slave owner. So that's why Casimir said, yeah, I recognize that, but my ancestors are the beauty and the power of the sovereign people. So I want to say 2 more things very quickly in relation to the holistic. Well, first we have to kind of, we are responsible, each of us is responsible for our own healing. And the second is, once we are into that, we have to the link or disengage with the spider web, as a kind of a speaker in the introduction said. The spider web, we call the colonial metric of power. So because we call it colonial metric of power, we're trying to analyze how the spider web works. But the spider web is a very good metaphor to understand that we are enslaved. We are enslaved, especially now with technology, with the iPod, with the television, with all this kind of thing. So there is a lot of work to do here, but this is conversation. Conversation, there is no expert in healing, cannot be expert in healing. Healing is a communal conversation. Mm-hmm. For me, education is that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. So now we heard that healing is not only constituted in an overt kind of resistance that Joy talked about to racist practice, but ultimately, as everybody else suggested, is about providing space and processes that can enable us to engage each other, that human relationships, but also acting out our human sort of mutual caring. I think it was Du Bois who said that he sees that the freedom that Paul talked about to start with, the freedom narrative, has to be in the sun, stand in the sun. And so, yes, if we borrow that metaphor to truly allow humanity to co-flourish with nature, we haven't talked about that, and to stand in the sun is to instill those values and educate our children to be actional, so that we can preserve in all our relations that love and care and respect for each other and for all things of value in the world. And that is truly humane world. So I thank you through this panel for your excellent contribution, and apologize for not having enough time. But next, for the audience, this program will conclude with an inspirational dialogue between two living legends. You know, Max Miller, who's UNESCO Slave Route Project's spokesperson, and an African-American jazz musician and composer. And there's also Ray Lima, who is a Congolese musician and composer. They're going to talk about the power of music for healing and cultural transformation. Thank you all.
Welcome, friends. Here we are in Paris, in the studio at TV 5 Monde. I am Yves Bigot, your host tonight. With me is Ray Lima, the great Congolese from Kinshasa musician, composer, piano player, all-around artist. And we have from Los Angeles with us Marcus Miller, great artist, also composer, very famous bass player, and playing many instruments. And you have a very, very long career as a studio session musician. You've played with everybody, and mostly with David Sanborn, with Luther Vandross, and famously with Miles Davis, for whom you composed the album with Tutu. You both are here for UNESCO, because we are going to talk of the study of transgenerational traumas as an emergent field of research in psychology, sociology, and other related disciplines, while looking to understand how mass cultural and historical traumas can impact future generation, and how it translates to music, through music, and how music can act as healing those transgenerational traumas. So welcome to both of you. We'll start with you, Marcus. Do you think that this concept of transgenerational trauma can help us understand better the contemporary consequences of the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery in the United States?
I absolutely do. I think that the most obvious, or one of the most obvious situations, is that people who have experienced trauma, extreme trauma, when they have children and they're raising their children, they can't help but transfer some of that trauma to their children, and that's how it crosses generations. It can take the form of their views on authority. It could take the form of their views on education, their views on how to raise children, their views on how to discipline children. So I think this emerging field is very important. It also, on an institutional level, really can affect people who are in power if they have had transgenerational transfers of concepts of race relations. You know, for example, if you were raised by parents who had racist views, it's probably going to transfer to you. And you may, without knowing, transfer those views to your children. So it's important for us to recognize and maybe try to break the chain.
Did you yourself personally experience that?
I experienced it a lot, but it was very interesting. I remember having a conversation with my father, and he said at a certain point he had an epiphany. He realized that he was transferring concepts to me that had been transferred to him. For example, there's a lot of blacks from a certain generation who would discourage their kids from having aspirations to do certain things. Oh, you want to be a politician, or you want to be an artist. That's really not going to work for a black guy. You might want to lower your expectations because you have a better chance for success. And I remember my dad saying to me at a certain point, he said, wait, I'm transferring these ideas from my generation to my kids, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So I experienced that. I've experienced, of course, racism. I'm from a generation where the racism was not so overt. By the time I became 12 years old or so, racism was very subtle, you know what I mean? But there were still teachers who discouraged me from certain fields. You know, science might not be your thing, Marcus. You might want to try something else that's a black person could be more successful in. So those kind of things, you know, luckily my father was strong enough and aware enough and conscious enough to recognize that in himself And I'm trying to do the same thing with our kids, you know what I mean? So yes, I've experienced it.
In regard, do you think that the election of President Obama changed something in the views that the Afro-American people view themselves and their place in the American society?
The election of Obama was incredible for Black people, especially young Black people. I remember 1969, when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I'd watch television and I didn't see many Black people on TV. And then one day I turned on the television and I saw Michael Jackson, 10 years old himself, looked just like me, or I looked just like him, you know, with the afro and and everything. And he was tremendous. And I can't tell you how that changed my life, just to see myself represented in mainstream American media. So that's Michael Jackson, who was a great entertainer, a great singer. Imagine what young people, 10 years old, felt when they looked up and saw a president who looked like them. I remember an image of a young Black girl. She got to meet President Obama. She was very young, and all she could do was touch his hair. She just wanted to touch his hair and feel it and touch her own hair. You can't really express how important it is to see that. So those young people are growing up without that baggage of, you know, a Black person can't be in a position of power. So it was very important.
Ray, as for you, colonization was an experience of huge violence for the African continent. Do you think that this concept of transgenerational trauma is important to understand the current situation of the African continent?
The colonization was a little different in the approach, the way they came to us in Africa. You know, I'm from a Belgian colony, and they used religion a lot. They used religion to get...
Catholic religion.
Yeah, really. And a lot of Congolese, till today, they have the feeling that they were serving the devil before the white people came. So till today, they have those images where they just see Jesus, white person with blue eyes, the Virgin Mary, a white person with blue eyes and blonde. They have developed, we have developed, like an insidious, how I would call it, it's a complex of inferiority. We didn't have a really upfront violence like this. They took us very, very smooth, so that till today, a lot of Africans, they still feel the white person is, wow, is something else than us. That's why I feel very frustrated with the leaders, the political leaders in Africa, because they never approach that problem up front. First, the slavery. They never talk about slavery in Africa. And sometimes I've tried to talk about it and say that, do you know that slavery, the white people didn't come just and took us over. No. They had people who participated, people from our own color.
Mm-hmm. In the slave trade.
Yes, we participate in that thing. And the people will never hear that Africans get really, really aggressive when we tell them that we were part of that thing. And I think it's very important to make amends in that situation before we can go over that and start being free. As long as we refuse to see the real reality, till today, we're still in that attitude of, even for colonization, we're still accusing white people. We don't realize that we are in a complex, the way we live till today, we're in a complex in front of the white person. And that thing, if they find ways to explain it to our people, maybe it could help a lot. But I think we have to take our destiny in our hands, try to find a way to educate our own people. Because many of those leaders, they behave exactly like the colony, the colonisateur.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they...
Like the Europeans.
They just took the same place where the white person was. They feel it's their due. And as long as we behave that way, these thing you're talking about, that movement, it's going to help, for sure. It's going to help because more and more we have younger people who have the capacity to analyze situations, and we have people like my generation who are aware, because I've traveled a lot around the world. Like said Marcus, his father told him that, wait a moment, I have the impression that I'm transferring something that I shouldn't. Now we're having more and more a generation that doing that. But in the global situation, I think it should be more coming from us. We have to amend, to make amend about that thing. Those two things, slavery and colonization.
Ray, you were growing up in Kinshasa.
I did.
In DRC.
Yes.
Which is a capital of music
yes.
in Africa.
Yes.
When you were growing up there, you were aware of Jimi Hendrix and the Motown and Stax artists. Did that in some ways show you that you could be worldwide? And did that help you think that your music, the music from Congo, could be heard throughout the world?
To tell you the truth, I'm a very particular case because first I became a musician not because I wanted to become a musician, but because I wanted to become a priest in the first place. I went to the seminary because I wanted to become a priest, and there they gave us just tests like they give to children, and they told me, you are a musician. They didn't ask me, they just told me, you are a musician. So that was the Belgians who told you that, yes,
right?
Yes. So I took it like part of my vocation, that becoming a priest meant that I should be a musician. So for long, very long, I didn't even think about it. I was just playing. And my first concert, as a matter of fact, it was the Sonate au clair de lune from by Beethoven. Yes. I was very far from Congolese music. And yeah, it's I had never thought about becoming a star or no.
What was your relationship to the Afro-American black music? And as you were in Kinshasa, there was the fight of the century.
Yes.
With Muhammad Ali, and that was George Frazier.
Yes.
And there was a huge concert where Manu Dibango played from Cameroon, but also a lot of American stars came to play for Mobutu, who was the president of Zaire, as your country was called then. I guess that was a huge event.
Yes, it was a huge event.
But for you, was it for you?
No. For me, there again, it was very different because the event took place in '74.
Yeah.
And in '73, the office of the Mobutu's office, they approached me with a project. They said, we're going to have a huge event here. And the president feels that we have to show them the real Congo. So we have in mind to build, to put together a fantastic national ballet that could show our culture. And we think that you could be the musical director for that ballet. But those people didn't speak the same language. And rhythmically, they were all very different. And you know that one thing that I didn't know then, I was educated with the Western system, where they count 1, 2, 3, 4. They say, this is a 4/4 rhythm. This is a 6/8 rhythm. And it took me a long time before I realized that in our tradition, they don't count that way at all. Because there, they use what we call today in the business, claves. Clave is a rhythmic phrase. And normal Congolese rhythm is composed of two claves that intersect. And then you have the master drummer come on top of those two phrases.
So that it has a trance-like effect.
For sure, it's trance music. But the real problem is that we don't have that many metrics in music. You know, you have a 4/4, 6/8, 7/8, 7/4. But when we started rehearsing, I would hear. I was trying to build something that could sound like a group. Like one group. So I decided that every day we're going to put one tribe in the middle, and everybody around, we're going to take small percussions and try to accompany the tribe that's in the center without disturbing the music. But for at least 6 months, what happened, every day someone would come to my ear and say, you know, the rhythm they're playing there, you know that it's a pity, but it really sounds wrong. When we're going to play, you're going to hear the real thing. I tell you, you know, Marcus, it was really freaky because as a musician, I was counting. I had my equipment, and every day I was taking notes. I would hear one tribe play 6/8 because we have a lot of 6/8 rhythms in Congo. They would play a 6/8. The next one is going to play 6/8. But between them, every day someone would come and say, they're playing it wrong. And it's only after 6 months that I realized that since the clave is the base of their music, and a clave is a phrase, the phrases are dependent on the language they speak. So, for example, I give a phrase that goes like ta ta tam ta 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 ta. According to the language of the tribe, the same phrase would have a different
twist.
Yes, it's like the English from New York and the English from Minneapolis. It's not the same. When you speak English, you listen, you say, oh, wow. They speak
different accents.
Really, they speak very, but it's clean and proper English. It was the same thing, but it took me ages before I figured out what was the problem. And those are the problems that, till today, we haven't approached them to explain that those countries like mine will not, till today, not really nations. Because we all the time hearing differences and feeling that the other guy, is from that given tribe, and he's a little weak, that they're a little weird in their heads. So every new president is going to try to bring his people around. So
make it official.
Make it official. But I think it's really important that we approach the thing from the base. And the base is that we have to build first a nation, have an inside an identity that comes from inside, from our culture, from the same dream and the same way of feeling. And today we haven't done that at all.
Since the 17th century,
yes,
the black body has been treated as a commodity, and blackness at the center of demonizing peoples of African descent. However, given this history, there has been resistance to violent subjugation and systemic oppression, both within the African continent and amongst the diasporas. This includes an overall agreement that culture, in the very broadest sense, such as music, can enable our agency and resistance to that oppression. What do you make of that, Marcus?
Well, I know from the American standpoint, music is very important. It was really the only thing that wasn't stripped from the Africans when they came to the Americas. They weren't allowed to retain their language or their religion or even their names. But for some reason, they were still allowed, even when they were working in the fields, they were still allowed to sing, right? And so music became very important because they used to embed, they used to hide messages in the music in order to communicate to each other. So you had to learn, if you listen to black music, you have to learn sometimes how to listen beyond the words. Because when they were working in the fields, they couldn't be overt with how they felt about their situation. So the words would be, "My Lord, what a wonderful morning." But if you listen to the melodies and you listen to the rhythms, you could hear and understand the real message. And I think that continues to this day. I mean, a lot of people from outside the black community, they say, you guys aren't talking about anything, because from the white world, the music starts from the words down, right? Bob Dylan, you know what I mean? The music was, simply an accompaniment to the words. But in a lot of versions of black music, the message comes from the bottom. The message comes from the rhythm. The message comes from a certain emotion that the melodies make. And this is how we communicate with each other. So music was really a salvation for Black Americans. And, you know, this type of music where emotion was very important, a wide range of emotion. These slave songs became the blues, they became gospel, they became jazz, they became R&B, funk music. And those rhythms eventually went into mainstream, not just America, but all over the world, where the rhythm is everything. I'll give you an example. We have copyright laws that help you determine a song, right? And for ages, early on in America, the copyright laws were a song is comprised of the lyrics and the first 4 or 5 notes of the melody. I don't remember exactly the law, but it was the words and the melody, right? So in the 1970s, people would borrow the rhythm from another song. They borrowed the bass line from another song. And the original songwriter would go, wait, they stole my song. But the law is lyrics and melody. Yeah, but don't you hear that bass, man? That's my song. You hear the beat? That's my song. So only recently have we begun to revise the laws, the copyright laws, to reflect the African elements of music. You had the melody, the lyrics, which I consider, and the harmony, I consider them the European elements, right? But now, because the African influence in music all over the world is so strong, you have to consider that people recognize a song before the singer ever sings. Why? It's because, you know, I know that beat. I know that beat. Oh, that's my song, right? Singer is still waiting for 30 seconds to come in. So this method of communication is really important, almost to the point where the lyrics have to be simple, so that they don't distract. And there's a similarity with opera, right? European opera. The composers of opera, they would have to find a text, a story that they would write their opera to. And they always picked really simple stories. The Ice Queen is sitting on the top of the ice mountain, and the first guy climbed the mountain and kissed her. Whatever, right? But the music, the music was incredible, right? And it was purposely, I believe, done that way because you didn't want the lyrics to distract the attention from all the emotion that the music conveyed. So I think that these African elements are really important because they were so important initially to the Black community. This was the only thing we had. And the last thing I'll say is I remember when I was 7 years old, 8 years old, Martin Luther King was assassinated. I didn't know who he was until the day he was assassinated because my parents were very upset, you know, and I said, what's going on? And they said Martin Luther King was assassinated. And in the hour before I had to go to school, they basically explained to me who he was. For the rest of that day, for the rest of the week, I just watched TV. And
you didn't know who he was?
No, I was 7 or 8 years old. You know, I knew who Willie Mays, the great baseball player, was, but I didn't know who Martin Luther King was. So my parents, you know, look, by the end of that week, I was an expert on Martin Luther King. But I just remember seeing all these people walking hand in hand, marching and singing, "We shall overcome." I remember them singing that very simple lyric, but I recognized the depth of sorrow and the depth of pain and also the hope that melody contained. So I got a lesson pretty quickly.
And what Marcus was saying about the way that the African American people had to hide actually their soul and their messages in their music, so that the words and the meaning was not understood by the white people. Was that something that at any point applied in Congo when you were growing up, or not at all?
No, not at all. In the Congolese tradition, music is still a social game. It's the only continent where music was part of the daily life. I've made experiments on the field where at a feast in a village, I would call a youngster, maybe 5 years old, and ask him, can you play the rhythm that guy is playing? I would give him a stick and, can you play that rhythm? And slowly I realized that in a village, in a Congolese village, everybody is a rhythmatist. Everybody, the youngsters, the old people, the grandmama, the grandfather, they all, if you ask them, they know how to play their rhythm. So it was something that's just a social game. And I remember in the beginning when I was trying to bring those people to Kinshasa, some of them would tell me, are you crazy? You think that you're going to take me to become your musician? And he's going to call around and show me, listen, look here. These are my four wives. And those kids, they are mine. And I can go show you my plantations. And you want me to leave all those because you want me to come play the salsa for you in Kinshasa? You're completely crazy. So the approach to music is very different. But the one thing that really, I think, saved the Africans about that problem of music is that our music is trance music. And trance music, when you get into it, when it's really well made, you get into it, everything just goes away. The sorrows, everything just goes away. And that's one thing that kept people alive in Africa, because they've been through so many problems that normally they should all go crazy till today, because our presidents, they're terrible. Some of them are really terrible. And I don't know, Marcus, have you ever been to Kinshasa?
No, I only saw the fight on TV.
Oh, my goodness. I would love to take you to Kinshasa because it's a very musical country, Congo. But if you see the state of Kinshasa, the people are so poor. When it rains, for example, they're out of power, they're out of telephone, they're out of everything. But they're still happier and joyful. They love much more than here in Paris. Like people in Paris, when I go to Kinshasa and I come back here, the first thing I notice is that here people are very sad. In Kinshasa, you see in their misery, they're still so lively. And that's when I understood that that type of music, as you called it, that rhythm, is really essential in our culture. It's a science for healing. And I remember being part of some ceremonies where they were healing people through rhythm.
That is a very interesting way that you should mention and explain that to us, because throughout human history, music has always had therapeutic values and been part of medicine and, as you said, health and healing. And even Bob Dylan, which whom Marcus mentioned earlier, says that he plays healing music when he was asked, but why do you do that? How would you qualify what you're doing? And he said, I'm playing healing music.
Yes, but I found it normal because today, even in science, they have discovered that the whole universe is just vibration. Music is vibration, and the whole universe is vibration. You and me sitting here with Marcus there, the same vibration going through the universe. So music is not something that we should take so lightly. It's very, very profound in the human being. It's essential to the human being. It's just now that music has become only for fun.
Entertainment.
Yes, just entertainment. But when you go back in the history of humanity, they were aware that music is really essential to the human being.
Marcus, do you identify with what Ray just told us?
They have experiments where they connect a machine that generates a sound, tone, and they connect it to a plate. Maybe you've seen this.
I've seen.
And on the plate is sand,
yes,
right?
Yes.
And they direct a tone onto the plate.
Yes.
And incredible, the sand goes into the most unbelievable patterns.
Yes.
Completely like a snowflake. It goes, and then you change the tone to another note. Exactly. The sand rearranges itself into another pattern. So imagine what sound is doing inside our bodies. Imagine what sound could do inside our bodies if they take this very simple experiment and develop it to where it could change our cellular structure. You know what I mean? It sounds, to a regular medical doctor, I'm sure this sounds crazy, but it's very true that sound affects you. You know, if you have pets, certain instruments, certain sounds, I can calm my dogs down just by playing the acoustic bass, just playing rhythm. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's really important.
Yes, the pets or kids.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
When you write or play your music, Marcus, are you at any point aware of that healing effect of the music?
Early on, no. Early on, I was just playing, and I was part of the community, and my community was similar to the Congolese community in that everyone was musical. I don't know about my grandma. I'm not sure how good she was on the percussion, you know what I mean? But in general, I was just playing part of my culture. But after I saw a couple of my songs affect people, you know, I'd put out a record and another record, and all of a sudden I'd get all this reaction. I was a studio musician for 20 years. I never left New York. I was just in the studios playing for different musicians, different artists, Elton John, Whitney Houston, Mariah Carey, but I never left. After that period of my life, I began to do my own music, and I started to travel and meet the people who were listening to this music that I had been making for the previous 20 years. And that's when it changed. When I saw a guy, I did a version of Amazing Grace, the church hymn, and Shaka Khan sang as my special guest. And I met people who said, and I'm not lying to you, my wife was in a coma. She was laying there in the hospital, and I played this song over and over again. My grandfather was in the hospital. I played this song for him constantly, and they came back. I did not believe it, but I began to hear it more and more, not just with that song, but people connect to different songs in different ways, particularly because I do mostly instrumental music. So these songs can mean what you need them to mean in your life, because the lyrics aren't really guiding you anywhere. And I realized the power of music when I began to travel and meet the people who were listening. And I began to take what I'm doing a lot more seriously. Not that I didn't take it seriously before, but I realized that this is important. This music travels, it goes to places that you'll never get to, and it affects people that you don't know.
Really. Ray, do you have the same experience, and do you have the same conscience when you're composing or playing the music, that the effect that it has on people's feelings and even their health?
Yeah, as Marcus said, it comes with, because I think consciousness grows with age. And with age and traveling and playing for very different audiences, and I realized the same thing that he said, because you get a feedback from the people you play for. And some people would come and say, like he said, oh, my goodness. And slowly you realize the impact that you have on people. And then you become very prudent with music. You start making music differently. Because in the beginning, of course, it's just fun when you're a young person. It's just fun. But the more you play for people, you realize, wow, you have something that is power in your hands. So you have to be careful with power.
So that's a big responsibility.
It is. It is.
To move on to another song. 1 year ago, the whole world was shocked by the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the institution that was supposed to actually protect him. This public exhibition of brutality has shown how deeply seated racialized practices are in the United States, and how racial discrimination is characterizing many aspects of our institutions. What has stayed with most people in this tragedy is that what George Floyd whispered in agony was, "I can't breathe." Since then, these words have been reverberating around the world and echoing the song, Marcus, that you had produced with Chuck D from Public Enemy in 2015, which was entitled "I Can't Breathe." Why did you choose that name at the time? And I suppose, obviously, it resonates very strongly now with you.
Well, unfortunately, that wasn't the first time we heard that phrase. 6 years ago, Eric Garner was in the same situation. He was selling cigarettes outside of a bus station in Staten Island, New York. And the police wanted him to stop and move on or whatever. And next thing he knew, he was in a chokehold. And he was the first one we heard say, "I can't breathe." And he ended up dying. And so I wrote the song for the Eric Garner situation six years ago. And what's really just painful for me is to see a song like that all of a sudden have new relevance because of the same thing in 2020. It's just really sad.
It is.
You can play that song today, and it's the same effect and the same relevance as it was 6 years ago.
And Ray, in your repertoire, there is this very beautiful cover that you play entitled Atandele. That's Lingala.
That's
okay,
Lingala.
The main language of Congo and of Central Africa as a whole. This song was written in the 1940s, if I'm correct, which was the colonial period in Africa. But it's kind of it's a song that has kind of prophetized an end of the oppression against black people in Africa. And I listened to the song before I joined you guys there, and it made me think the words, I don't speak Lingala, but I had them translated. It reminds me of, a change is going to come. The great Sam Cooke song about the civil rights. And also Bob Dylan's The Times They Are Changing. It kind of says the same thing. It's an hopeful song that things are definitely going to change, and that, the people who were oppressed are going to be set free someday.
That's true. First, it's not the same song, in fact, because it's just the title. The title from Adu Elenga, and I took the title because I was trying to bring the same message, because I told you that our people are very desperate. They have the impression that the white people are so powerful that they're never going to get out of that situation. So it's a message of hope. Attendele means tôt ou tard, sooner or later.
Things will change when Judgment Day comes.
Yes, there's a saying in Lingala. They say, we've never seen an endless day as we have never seen an endless night. The two are one thing. Mm-hmm. That's what it means, Attendele.
Yeah, okay. Two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. One day, the day has to turn into a night, and at a certain moment, the night has to turn into a day. So we don't need to be desperate.
Just as Manu Dibango was saying, you can't see black on black, and you can't see white on white.
No. That's right.
So you have to have black and white to see each other.
Absolutely. Yeah, you see, that's one thing that we're trying to make our people understand. If you look at the history of all the empires that the world has known, the empire grows, and one day the empire dies. So we just have to keep going, keep ourselves straight and strong, and things are going to change. It's when you just get desperate and you lay down, then that's really the end. But if you stay straight up, the change is going to come.
And what was the intent when you decided to take that title and to make that statement?
Because I felt that desperation in my people. You really feel it in Kinshasa, especially if you speak the language. You know, in Lingala, they call white people Mwana Maria. That means the son of Mary, Jesus. Mm-hmm. The white people are Mwana Maria. Just to tell you how deep it goes. They don't say the white person. No. They say Mwana Maria.
Mm-hmm. So that makes there's already something divine.
Already something divine
in the white person.
Yes.
by naming them that way?
In Ivory Coast, I've worked a lot in Ivory Coast.
Mm-hmm.
They say very often, they say, you know, God is great, but the white person is not little. The first time I heard it, I said, what? He said, great, God is great, but white people are not little. They're great also. And it's so shocking when you hear those small things, because before the change could come, you have to feel equal to the white person. If they don't even feel equal to the white person, how can they change anything to their situation? That's why I did the tune again, because till today it's still relevant, exactly like I Can't Breathe with Marcus. Till today it's still relevant.
As composers and performers, you have both been making and playing music that expresses a fusion of many different cultures, including an influence from Gnawa music. What has drawn you to Gnawa music? And there is actually Gnawa, it's a trophy for when the Gnawa culture was made into the human heritage by UNESCO. This is why I've taken this with me, which I was granted because we work here at TV5 Monde with the Gnawa Festival in Essaouira, in Morocco, which is nearly the birthplace of Gnawa, and it is a place that was visited by Jimi Hendrix.
Yes,
you know,
I know.
and this is a fantastic festival. But what had drawn you to this music? Because you know it's starting maybe with you, Ray, because that's very far from Kinshasa, Morocco. It's nearly as far as the United States.
No. As a matter of fact, you know that the Gnawa is when you go to Morocco. Me coming from Kinshasa, going to Morocco, when I heard the Gnawas, right away, I realized that was black music, not Arab music.
Mm-hmm.
And black music, today, I'm kind of specialist because I worked with so many traditional musicians that right away I knew exactly what to play with them. And till today, when I play with the Gnawas, because I had a big tour in Africa with a group, a band of Gnawas. They're my people. They're really my people. I don't have to think. I just grab my guitar or my keyboard and I play with them, and they're just so happy because they're here.
You mean you share the same spirit?
Exactly.
And Marcus, you've been interested in Gnawa music too. What has drawn you to it? Was it the fact that Gnawa music seems to embed the practice of healing music in their heart?
The first experience I had was at Essaouira, at the festival. And they invited me to be a special guest. And I don't know how many people were there, maybe 30,000. And they were there for 3 days, dancing and celebrating, truly in a trance. It was like America has these rave dances where the same thing happens, but this was with no chemicals involved, you know? It was just a beautiful thing. And the gimbri, which is the instrument that's depicted in that statue that you have, I realized very quickly that it's the ancestor to the instrument I play, which is the bass guitar.
Exactly.
So Ray, I got on the stage with Malem Mustafa Bakbu, and
I know
he started playing his rhythm, and I said, "Oh, that's kind of funky, okay?" And I realized this connection that I wasn't aware of, and before I knew it, he and I were nose to nose.
Yes.
Like the funk, you know what I mean, playing.
Yes.
And he's playing the gimbri, and I'm playing the bass guitar, and we were connected, and that experience really affected me. They gave me a gimbri as a gift later that night, and I spent the next 4 months trying to get a sound out of it because it looks similar.
Yes.
But it's not necessarily the same instrument.
No.
But I got it together to the point where I was able to play it.
Yeah.
That you mentioned, I Can't Breathe. If you listen to that record, you'll hear the gimbri and I have Aphrodisia, where I featured the gimbri. I don't play it in front of Malem Mustafa Bakbu. I play it on my back so he doesn't see me. But just to be able to connect was an incredible experience. I heard that Ganawa musicians were basically, this is what I heard, that they were basically street musicians who played this ancient form of music until some people said this is a national treasure and this music should be celebrated. And then they created the festival. I don't know how much of this is true, but that's what I heard. And if it is true, I think it's incredible because now we all know about Ganawa music, and it's a worldwide genre to be very well respected.
And it goes back to what Ray was saying earlier of the power of that trance of Gnawa music being so healing. Is that right?
They go to another place.
Really?
Right? The people
really.
Listening to this music. And I just read some philosopher from Northern Europe who said music and musicians are arrogant enough to think that their music transcends politics and transcends worldly issues. And they should realize that music is nothing but a political tool. And I am sure the person who wrote that was never at a Ganawa festival, okay? I'm sure that person has never been to a blues festival in New Orleans or to any of the places where music truly elevates people. It truly, like Ray was saying in the Congo, people who are living in miserable circumstances all of a sudden can see light and experience joy. Music is really powerful. I do really believe that it transcends politics. That's not to say that it can't be used for politics in good ways and bad ways, but it has another dimension, absolutely.
It has.
Okay. Thanks a lot to you both. I guess we are going to wrap this up, unless you have something that you feel you want to add to this topic. Marcus?
I just want to hang out with Ray in the Congo. So, man, I'm really fascinated. You know, I've been to Morocco and Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal and Kenya, but I would really love to see what you just described.
Listen, if I'm a believer, and listening to you, I know that you are a believer too. So let's just make it happen.
All right.
Yes, sir.
All right, so thank you both. Really, thank you so much, Marcus, for being with us from Los Angeles. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Ray, to be in Paris with us for UNESCO and for this very, very important subject.
And I thank you to make it possible.
Thank you so much. Yes. Goodbye, friends.
Thank you.